It took only a little touch to make a car that you see in the video explode, killing both its driver and the driver of the other car. At least that's what everyone said about this model. The situation is controversial, but we think it's pointless to argue that it is an absolute failure for Ford and also one of the worst cars in history. In front of you, you see the legendary in its cheapness and low quality Ford Pinto. Why did it become like this? Why did the engineers turn a blind eye to an obvious, fatal mistake that could easily have been prevented? Let's look into it. The story of the Ford Pinto, the car that explodes from everything. The history of American cars has been side by side with the European car industry since the early 50s of the last century. Eternal opponents, irreconcilable enemies, they tried to outdo each other by all parameters. Thus, at the end of the 50s, German manufacturers introduced the Beetles, a form of small cars with a low-capacity engine. Compared to the expensive cars of previous years, the Beetle cost very little. Many Europeans could afford to buy such a model without thinking twice. This shipment came to the US as well, headed by the famous Volkswagen Käfer model. In the American version, it was called Beetle. Naturally, the American car industry had nothing to oppose such a format, and it was gaining in popularity every year. At that time, several cars came out at once, aimed to answer the Beetle. General Motors had released its latest models. We told you about their failed Chevrolet Corvair in another video. The business has not stopped only with that. The magnificent Chevrolet Corvette was released. Chrysler Corporation also prepared and released the Plymouth Valiant, recognized as one of the best cars in history. The great and powerful Ford Motor Company also did not stand aside. The Ford Falcon model followed, which also became a kind of answer to Volkswagen. All of these were the same small cars and quite cheap, usually priced under $2,000. But these cars were still made for the American mentality, with a love of luxury, high speed, and large size. That's why they didn't end up being the answer to the Beetle models. The manufacturers quickly realized this, but they did nothing until the mid-60s. Structural change was beginning to spread throughout the country. The American mentality had changed again. Gone was the love of luxury. Comfort and security became a much more important priority for U.S. residents. The strongest demonstration of this was the import of the second wave of small, compact, and comfortable cars. It was the Japanese auto industry, Toyota and Datsun. This predetermined the emergence of a new model format in the U.S. Instead of the usual compacts, which hold up to 6 people and have a solid size, there were subcompact cars of relatively small size, usually holding up to a maximum of 4 people. By the way, the car in question today could seat 2 people in its original configuration. Then there was a version of the Classic, which had enough space to comfortably fit 4 passengers. These models did not become part of the popular segment of cars for the whole family at the time, and took a niche position as a spare car. They were bought by inexperienced drivers, women, and students. Not least of all, this is due to the low price of this kind of car. As luck would have it, Ford already had experienced producing small models. It quickly accepted the new rules and began to work on a new model. This model was called the Ford Pinto, and it was introduced in 1970, the day after General Motors introduced its subcompact, the Chevrolet Vega. However, we mentioned that Ford Motor Company had a history of producing small cars. There's a reason for that. They designed their car based on the experience of the Ford Cortina, a car that failed to carve a niche in America, and based on the Ford Escort, from which they took the transmission and propulsion transmission for the Pinto. It was not made for nothing. The manufacturer wanted to introduce the car by the fall of 1970, when the development was only at full speed in 1968. It was given a period of 25 months to create a complete and new model. Usually, new cars were created within 3.5 years, 43 months. So this turnaround in the creation of the car is considered the fastest in history. The manufacturer wanted to see a model that would weigh less than 4,000 pounds and cost less than $2,000. In the end, Ford Motor Company presented the market with what seemed at first glance to be an incredibly high potential model at a very low price. And that potential could have been unleashed if not for the striking, perhaps overly conspicuous negligence of the engineers. The price of the car was incredibly low, $1,850. It was the sum of 5 salaries of a typical American. Even a student, if he wanted to, could afford a Ford car. It would seem to be a goal of unthinkable success, even for Ford. But this low price was conditioned by those peculiarities, because of which a scandal broke out about the Pinto, and production of the car was stopped. We are speaking about maximum possible cheapening of all components of the automobile. Everything was economized: the engine, the steering wheel, the suspension, the materials the car was made of, safety, even comfort. That is, everything that was so demanded in America at the time. The reason for this was an incredible rush and a desire to create a car that almost all citizens could afford. Usually, the process of outfitting a car, that is, the process by which the parts necessary for the car are created according to the design of the engineers, takes 18 months. That is, everything goes in sequence. First, the parts are created, then engineers test them, and when they find out that the parts pass the quality test, they are sent complete sets to the car makers, who will build a new car out of the designed parts. In the case of the Ford Pinto, everything looked quite different. This perhaps can be called the most unusual case of building a car. The fact is that the tooling went on simultaneously with the creation of the car. It means the engineers were figuring out what parts were needed and how to produce them at the same time. To give you an idea of how engineers felt at the time, imagine a situation where you get a recipe for making a cake, but instead of being given a list of ingredients, you're asked to come up with your own ideas for it. That is, not to take existing shortcakes, for example, but how to create new kinds. This is roughly how Ford engineers worked. It could come as no surprise then that a faulty fuel tank was not noticed before production even began. And when it was discovered, no one bothered to report it to the company boss. Everyone was afraid. Everyone was trying to smooth out the production as much as possible. It was even said that anyone who told the president of the company, Lee Iacocca, would have been instantly fired. In those years, safety wasn't Ford Motor Company's headache. These concepts went kind of parallel to each other, and we think this decision is wrong because 5 years previously, the book published by journalist Ralph Nader, Unsafe at Any Speed, provoked a major public outcry around road safety. But about that, as well as its impact, and in particular the reaction of car manufacturers to it, we tell you about in another video. So it was forbidden to talk to Lee himself on this topic. It was a strict taboo. Whenever it came to anything that would delay the car's release, Lee would say, "Get to know the product goals and get back to work." There was a reason the car was built so quickly and cheaply, and a reason it was so different from the small cars of Japan. It was made aimed at young people, with a focus on a sports car with bright colors and eye-catching design. The body type, fastback. This in turn changed the design and also imposed its own impact on safety. This is evidenced by a rather weak 4-cylinder inline engine, but we'll talk about it later. Ford Motor Company represented the Ford Pinto car as the carefree little car. That was its advertising slogan. The ads informed customers that when they bought a Ford Pinto, they would leave worries about prices, maintenance, and cost out the door. That when they bought this little car, the customers would never spend large sums on repairs and auto parts again, because they were cheap and affordable, and certainly not that necessary if you owned this car. Unfortunately for Ford, there was a large part of the population that kept an eye on how safe it would be when buying the car. They had no interest in being crushed to pieces or burned alive in an accident. The car went on sale in September of 1970. In October, the first run of 26,000 models was already recalled because they found one very serious design flaw. Because of this, if the throttle, a device that regulates airflow into the engine, was open more than halfway, the accelerator got stuck. The accelerator is the device that directly regulates the speed of the car. That is, you could not brake or speed up even if you really wanted to, and you would want to. This breakdown practically guarantees that you will have an accident, and given the rest of the design, it's far from certain that you'll be able to survive the accident. Naturally, the car was quickly recalled. This was the first of many Ford Pinto recalls. Another design flaw was equally fatal to the car and to the passenger. This car was called self-exploding for a reason. Because of this flaw, smoke and gas would accumulate right under the hood of the car, and an electrical spark would trigger a natural explosion. After Ford Motor Company became aware of more than 100 such cases, they reluctantly agreed to recall a batch of these cars for the second time. For the second time in 5 months since the car's release. The company itself claimed that no one was hurt as a result of these recalls, but it was just a line of defense, and they couldn't use it indefinitely. If you get into the history of the car, it turns out that the company knew in advance that this car could severely injure or even kill a person. It conducted a crash test as far back as 3 years before the car's release and discovered a potentially deadly flaw, both to the fate of the car and to the fate of its customers. The fuel tank, as we said in the video, was located in the back. This meant that if it was full enough, at the slightest rear collision with other cars, the car had every chance of exploding. The tank would be bolted through and hit the muffler. Fortunately, not all cars exploded, but every car could do it. The man you see in the picture is named Dennis Goya. He was in charge of recalls of batches of Ford vehicles. He claims that thoughts of a Ford Pinto recall visited him when he saw the complete burned-out remains of such a wrecked car. But the recall department, perhaps believing him, cited a lack of evidence and decided not to recall the car, which was Lee Iacocca's most beloved project. That all changed, however, when Goya and others saw the infamous Ford Pinto memorandum, which stated bluntly that such a potentially fatal defect did exist in the car, and they knew it when they put the model, which failed the crash test, on sale. However, with such evidence in hand, Goya wouldn't do anything about it. He was threatened, told not to conduct a recall on the car, or, worse for him, not to go to the press about it. He was assured that the car was being thoroughly tested, and Goya took his superiors at their word, as if forgetting that once before, not more than 3 years earlier, the company had already lied about the safety tests. That was a big mistake. According to the official data provided by Ford Motor Company itself, 27 people died from the explosions. According to unofficial data, the victims were between 180 and 500 unfortunate car owners. The number of people injured or killed in the sudden fire or explosion of the Ford Pinto also remains unknown. Do you know what this car was missing? One simple detail, costing $11. It was a partition, the essence of which, to explain in general terms, was to protect against bolt penetration into the fuel tank, respectively, against penetration and the subsequent explosion. It could be put in, but at the customer's expense. Nowhere was it reported that such an important part was missing in a car with a rear tank. There was a simple calculation. Ford specifically released the originally defective cars because they hoped they could cover the lawsuits, and it would cost them half as much. They didn't expect the case to resonate as much as it did. In 1977, the investigative agency Mother Jones released an article based on that very memorandum, and it became known to the world that Ford had specifically produced life-threatening cars. It was called Pinto madness. Less than 24 hours after the article was published, the Center of Auto Safety filed a petition with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, demanding that the Ford Pinto be recalled. The investigation began on August 11, 1977. 9 months later, it came to a conclusion the world had known long before. The Ford Pinto's fuel system was faulty. Before the trial, Ford itself decided to recall 1.5 million vehicles. The production of these Pinto cars was stopped. Forbes magazine put the car in the list of the worst cars of all time. The Times did the same. But the main thing is this: it's not yet the fact that the car was so deadly. In 1991, journalist Gary Schwartz ran an article saying that the car wasn't more deadly than other models of the time. So whether the Pinto was a killer car is still debatable. But the fact that this car is one of Ford's worst models is not questioned by anyone. Be sure to write in the comments what you think of this car. Bye!